I'm interested in what happens to Jews who live in anti-Zionist societies. And what happens is they ultimately leave. If we look at the Jewish population of the former Soviet Union and we look at particular republics, we'll see that between 1980 and 2018, the percentage of Jews left in some of those republics, 75% of them left, if not more. If we look at what happened across North Africa and the Middle East in the wake of the establishment of the State of Israel, there are different estimates. One is 820,000 Jews fled those countries. Another I've heard recently is actually it was closer to 1.3 million. But the reality is, in 1948, there were 140,000 Jews in Algeria, and by 2017, there were about 50.
Hey, it's Aviva, and welcome to Boundless Insights. Once a month, I hand the mic to my colleague and friend, Dr. Rachel Fish, for a deeper, longer-form conversation that steps back from the headlines and helps us consider the ideas shaping our world. In today's episode, Rachel speaks with Professor Pamela Nadell, one of the country's leading historians of American Jewish life and the author of Antisemitism, an American Tradition. It's a new book tracing how anti-Semitism has existed in the United States from the colonial era to today. Rachel and Pamela trace anti-Semitism through the American story, from George Washington's promise of religious equality to the racialization of Jews in the 19th century, immigration restrictions, the Holocaust, and post-war America. They show how anti-Semitism has shifted, adapted, and endured. They also examine the present moment, including how anti-Zionism has emerged as a new expression of anti-Jewish hostility. There's a lot to cover, and so with that, I hand the mic to Rachel.
I am very pleased that today I have Professor Pamela Nadell joining me on the Boundless Insights podcast. Thank you so much, Pamela, for being here.
My pleasure.
So, Pamela, you have written this new book, Antisemitism, an American Tradition. I have to tell you, I devoured this book, and I found this book to be accessible, digestible, and extremely valuable for a larger American public audience, not just an academic audience, and really understanding the ways in which anti-Semitism has existed within American society from its earliest formation of the colonial days to the present. And what I'd like to do is really spend the next 45 minutes or so talking to you specifically about the historical framework that you utilized in presenting in your book the way in which anti-Semitism has existed in the American context, knowing quite well that the American Jewish experience is exceptional in many ways, and knowing that anti-Semitism in America is not the same as the way in which we have seen anti-Semitism play out in Europe, in Muslim lands, and in other communities worldwide. So that's what I'd like to do with you today.
Well, that sounds wonderful. Thanks for the careful read.
So, Pamela, help us understand from the way in which you shared in the book how anti-Semitism emerged and really showed up in American society in those early colonial days, and help us understand the ways in which that anti-Semitism presented itself and then shifted and morphed and transformed throughout American society.
Let's start with 23 Jews fleeing persecution in Brazil, landing in New Amsterdam, which was not yet called New York, in September 1654, and the governor of New Amsterdam wants to throw them out. He does not want Jews to stay in the colony, and he writes a letter because he doesn't make colonial policy. The policies are made by the company that owns the colony, which was back in Amsterdam in Europe, and it was called the Dutch West India Company. He has to write them a letter saying, I want to do this. I want to throw out the Jews. And in that letter, he shows how classic anti-Jewish ideas had come to America with the very first colonists. So they brought to America with them the idea that, as he writes, and I will quote, that the Jews were a deceitful race, such hateful enemies, and blasphemers of the name of Christ. He also talked about them being usurers, a reference to the fact that Jews were moneylenders in medieval Europe. He talked about their deceitful trading practices with Christians. He even used the idea that the Jews, if they stayed, would infect, that's his word, infect the colony. And that's an allusion to the idea that the Jews were bearers of disease, that they were responsible for the 14th century Black Death. So he starts off by showing us that the minute the Jews come to what will eventually become the United States of America, that they are already going to face anti-Jewish animus. It doesn't mean Jews won't succeed in America. You mentioned exceptionalism before. We could have a whole argument about that. But it does mean that being a Jew in America will also include encountering anti-Semitism.
And where are those stereotypical anti Semitic tropes coming from?
Those stereotypical anti-Semitic tropes come straight out of the Gospels. I mean, that's where we would have to start. Deceitful enemies, blasphemers of the name of Christ. Well, the Gospels blame the Jews for the death of Jesus, and that becomes a major theme in the development of early Christendom. And then the idea that the Jews are usurers, that they exact very high interest when they lend money, that's a result of the medieval restrictions that were put on Jews who moved to England and France and Germany, where because the church believed that usury was sinful, that exacting interest on money that you loaned was a sin, that the Jews were literally permitted to reside in Western European countries in very small numbers in the 1100s and the 1200s, as long as they engaged in money lending. And then the idea about the Jews being infecting Europe really comes out of the 14th century Black Death, where the Jews are blamed for causing the bubonic plague, in which it is estimated that a quarter, perhaps more, of Europeans died.
What I'm hearing from you again, though, are these ideas of these tropes and what we would call these big lies that are being reused, recycled, taken from a different context, but applied again towards the Jews in this new setting.
Right, exactly. And it happens, if we can jump, it happens today, right? On January 10th, 2026, a man firebombed a synagogue in Jackson, Mississippi, and he said he did it because it is the synagogue of Satan. And that's a quotation right out of the New Testament.
This is where, as an academic, I will say ideas and the world of ideas matter, because they don't stay in isolation within a particular historical context. They often are utilized and reinvigorated for a different political purpose and cause, but again, drawing on a historical legacy.
Exactly.
So take us from that moment and that letter to what happens in the early formation of the colonial days in America and the early period of Peter Stuyvesant.
Well, the early period of Peter Stuyvesant, he's told that, and this is 1654, he only is governor of New Amsterdam for another decade, because then in 1664, the British come in and conquer it and rename it New York. But Stuyvesant, so he gets an answer from Amsterdam saying, you cannot exile the Jews. You can't kick them out. We have Jews in Amsterdam. We need colonists. They are to be permitted to stay there. And Stuyvesant's immediate reaction was, if we allow the Jews in, that next we're going to have Lutherans and Papists. Papists are reference to Catholics. And so one could say he was sort of an equal opportunity hater of religious diversity. And he's told that the Jews, they need to be allowed to live here and to trade here as they do in Amsterdam. And then he tries other ways to make life uncomfortable for the Jews and ultimately fails in all of them. And it is a relatively short period of time. And then the Jews continue to live in New Amsterdam, now renamed New York, under the British and under, I would say, very similar circumstances in terms of They worship privately in a home. They do not build a synagogue, a public building, until 1730. And they trade. And the colonial Jews are a tiny community. We're talking about, at the most, by the eve of the revolution, 2,500, perhaps even as low as 1,500 Jews.
So, when do we start to see a shift where it will be the new America, the George Washington, who starts to say, wait a minute, we're going to be something different and we're going to treat the Jews differently?
Right. Washington in 1790 goes to Newport, Rhode Island. It's part of a closing tour of the ratification of the Constitution. Rhode Island's actually the last state that he goes to because they're the last ones to ratify it. And in Newport, Washington is greeted by representatives from all of the churches. And if you go to Newport, Rhode Island, you can see that the Hebrew congregation is up on a hill very close to the other churches of this now estate, former colony. And he's given a letter thanking him, praising his presidency. And he uses some of the language from that letter in a letter that he ultimately writes back to thank the Hebrew congregation. And he speaks of that this is a country which gives, quote, to bigotry no toleration. It won't allow that. No more do we speak of toleration of the Jews, which means they're here by sufferance, but rather it's a country that gives, quote, to bigotry no sanction. And it is the iconic statement. Washington actually wrote many letters to many different religious congregations, including other letters to other Jewish congregations. But this notion, to bigotry no sanction, and no more do we speak of toleration, really establishes American Jews as equal citizens. Although there are state laws, there are laws that will discriminate against Jews well down across the 19th century.
And what do some of those state laws look like at that time?
Some of the state laws, the initial state laws actually had restrictions on Jews holding office. And not until 1877 is the last state, New Hampshire, changes its rules that said that one had to be a Christian to hold public office. So those are some of the laws. Other laws impact Jewish life negatively. It's not that they're designed to restrict Jewish behavior, but they are laws that say that you cannot conduct business on the Lord's Sabbath. And Jews periodically, in different times and places, well into the 20th century, would get hauled before the courts for operating their sewing machines in their apartments or for trying to sell things on Sundays, because if Jews were religiously observant, then their shops were also closed on Sabbaths, on the Jewish Sabbath of Saturday. And that meant that there were 2 days a week that they could not be earning a living.
What I'm hearing, and it's interesting just for our listeners to really note, is that some of this early anti Semitic expression in America is still very much focused on the religious identification or the confessional identity of the Jews as a religion. Is that accurate?
Yeah. And the thing to remember, and you just used the word anti-Semitism, what we need to remember is that the word anti-Semitism is not coined until the late 1870s. That what we have at this time is anti-Judaism. Some might call it Judeophobia. There are other words that we could use for it, but we really have religious animosity against Jews based on religion. And then when we get to anti-Semitism, we have a very powerful transition.
Absolutely. And for sure, when you're referencing, 1879 and Wilhelm Marr coining and really politicizing the coining of the phrase and the political lexicon term of anti-Semitism, which is in the context of Europe, where it has to do also with the racialization of the Jews, I would love for you to then start to share how that racialization process is going to play out within the American context.
Right. I think, first of all, it's a great question because I think it's really important that we understand. Many of us are quite well familiar with racialization of Jews in Europe, and that became the basis for the Nazis' persecution of the Jews and for the Holocaust. And people don't quite understand how racialization of the Jews worked the same way in the United States. What happens over the course of the late 18th, and really mostly into the 19th century, is that the position of the Jews in European society changes because the ghetto walls are toppled. Jews they move out of the ghettos, they move to the cities, they integrate themselves very deliberately into European society. And for Wilhelm Marr, the theorist of anti Semitism that you mentioned, for Marr, that this is an enormous disaster because Jews have somehow managed very quickly to rise to positions of prominence in government circles and financial circles in the media. And he saw that there was essentially a struggle going on between Germandom and Judaism. And he was convinced that the Jews were winning. But he realized that his opposition to Jews was now based not on the fact that the Jews purportedly had killed Jesus and therefore should be punished for all times by the church. Instead, it had a different basis, and that different basis rested on the development of the pseudoscience of the races, and which argued that the races were immutable, that there was a hierarchy to them that could never be changed, and that the debased races, the lowest races, included the Jews. And so he needs a new word, and he comes up with the word anti-Semitism. He's borrowing Semite from Semitic languages. They're not Semitic peoples, but there were languages that were related, like Arabic and Hebrew, for example. And immediately the word anti-Semitism is glommed onto in the United States. Within a year of his publishing his book about the victory of the Jews over the Germans and his fear of that, that rabbis in the United States are now using the word anti-Semitism.
Why is that? Why is it so powerful, that word?
The word is so powerful because there's a difference, a huge difference between anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. And the difference is theoretically, within the framework of anti-Judaism, a Jew could convert to Christianity and they therefore should have been saved. They would have been saved. They'd be part of the mainstream. Now, we know from the introduction of the Inquisition into Spain in the late 15th century, when many Jews had, because of physical persecution, dragged to the baptismal fonts, converted to save their lives, we know that they and their descendants, people of Jewish descent, and they often use the phrase of Jewish blood, that those people were the targets of the Inquisition. So the idea of conversion, on the one hand, exists sort of as an ideal, but in practice, Jews who converted often continue to face discrimination.
So, within the American context, then, Professor Nadell, what happens to the American understanding of the Jew with this racialized conception, also knowing we have a history of racism that's playing out in American society at this moment simultaneously?
It's a really good point because it's really the rise of racial anti-Semitism almost dovetails exactly with the nation trying to figure out what to do about the formerly enslaved. First, actually in 1875, passing the first Civil Rights Act, which the Supreme Court invalidates a number of years later. And what we're seeing is as Jim Crow gets established in the United States, we're also seeing this moment where Jews, and now there are many more Jews in America than before. We're beginning to have East European Jews starting in the early 1880s coming into America fleeing persecution. So a community that in 1880 was maybe 250,000, which is still tiny, tiny fraction of the population of the United States, begins to grow and begins to have a stronger presence, especially in New York City, where so many of them landed and did not leave. But we're seeing that now there is the sense that Jews are racially distinctive and that being a member of a particular race includes some of the same characteristics that Stuyvesant talked about. They're crafty in business. They're lascivious. Stuyvesant didn't talk about that, but it's certainly a theme that begins to come up. And there's a sense also already that the Jews are trying to replace the real Americans, the storied families of the colonial era.
Within the framing then of how Jews are going to be targeted with this shift where it's not just about religion, but about this racial conception and racialized identity. Jews in this framework are not yet white in America. Can you talk a little bit about then, A, how Jews are perceived, and then when Jews do, quote unquote, become white in the American context?
The question is, do they ever fully become white in the
Very
American
much so.
context? That is the real question. Many of the Jews who come to America, not all in this period, but many of them come from Eastern Europe, from Russia and from Poland. And they present as white, they present as having white skin, but they're not accepted as whites. There's a very clear sense, certainly in the late 19th century and well beyond, that the Jews somehow remain distinctive and they remain racially distinctive, and they therefore confined to this kind of lower echelon of the hierarchy of the races. What's interesting is that historians argue, there's like a very fine book written called, When the Jews Became White Folk, or How the Jews Became White Folk. And it says it happened in the 1960s when various white ethnic groups like the Irish and the Germans are able to retain their ethnicity. We get this notion of ethnic studies in the United States, and the Jews kind of slot into that. The problem is the Jews never really easily slot in because there's always distinctions in terms of Jewish identity. And it kind of brings us up to today, because white nationalists claim Jews are definitely not white. And those who are targeting Jews from the left actually see Jews as the paradigmatic whites. So we don't really have a clear answer to this idea. I'll tell you a story somebody told me recently. It was somebody who was turning out for some of the protests coming from the left, and someone said to her, why are you here? You're white. And this woman's comment, and this is like just happened, she said, I'm not white. I'm just passing. I'm Jewish.
I mean, also my mind immediately goes to Charlottesville, 2017, where we saw very clearly white supremacists marching in Charlottesville with their Nazi emblems, the swastikas, the Confederate flag, chanting, carrying their tiki torches, Jews will not replace us.
Right.
Where it's abundantly clear Jews are not white. And then, as you are saying, many of us, and it's not just in the academy, but actually in many social justice movements that many of us care about, and I'm saying us as humans, Jews may find themselves in these settings where it is very clear that the pigmentation of their skin has dictated by some a very simplistic framework. And that simplistic framework is that your pigmentation is white and therefore powerful and therefore the oppressor.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this is the moment that we are in where Jews will not replace us. I showed that late 19th century, there were all these cartoons already making this argument. So the idea is old, about Jews trying to replace the rightful whites who, should be the masters of America. But you're right that coming from the other side, from progressive social movements, Jews are excluded because they're the paradigmatic white oppressors.
I want to take us back still historically before we just get fully to the present. And I'd like to ask you, Professor Nadell, specifically about, as you have the rise of Nazism and fascism in Europe, and we see that European Jewry is being decimated, how does American society perceive of the Jew in America?
When we get to the period after World War I, even before we're getting to the Nazi period of 1933, what we see is an effort in the United States, and it's how racism plays out in the U.S. Against the Jews, an effort in the United States to discriminate against Jews. And the first place that happens is in the passage of the 1921 Emergency Quota Act, and then which is kind of fixed in 1924 with the Johnson-Reed Act. And what happens is these are laws which, after having had an open society, 25 million people come to America between the 1880s and 1924, Jews, about are like 2.5 million Jews come in that time period. So they're a significant percentage of that community. So as that open immigration continued to swell, there was a tradition in America that was anti-immigrant. And the Immigration Restriction League was founded in the 1890s. And by 1921, we really see its fruits. And it's clear, if you read the congressional record, that some of the people they're trying to keep out are poor Jews who have survived World War I and horrible pogroms during the Russian Civil War, and who are clamoring to get out of Europe and come into America. And so they're immediately targeted. But those immigration acts never use the word Jew, because they only talk about percentage of people who can come from Russia, percentage of people who can come from Germany.
And what happens then in the wake of or during the period of the Holocaust?
What happens is actually this legislation is tremendously significant, because the first thing that we have to remember is that even before the Holocaust, the murder of the 6 million Jews is underway. Even before we get to that, the Nazis come to power on January 30th, 1933, and very quickly consolidate their power and the Weimar Republic. And as that happens, since the founding of the Nazi Party and their party platform of 1920, it shows that they intended to disenfranchise Jews, and to the extent possible, it's not clear they aimed to murder them at that point, but certainly to remove them from German civilization, much like Wilhelm Marr had wanted. Marr did not want Jews to have any influence over German society. And Jews begin to clamor to get out. But it is also, we must remember, the depths of the Great Depression in the United States. The German quota is actually a fairly large quota, because the quota system favored people who came from Anglo-Saxon countries. But it's not filled in any of these years until 1939, because the State Department puts up all sorts of restrictions to make it difficult for Jews to get out of Europe and into America. And the Germans at the same time are also making restrictions that are making it difficult for Jews to leave, because they're essentially robbing them of their property.
What you're describing is a very xenophobic American society, a place that, in theory, prides itself on being the land of immigrants. In theory, is about bringing the masses to its shores. What is happening historically at this moment in which that ideal is just shattered?
Right. The ideal's shattered for a number of reasons. I think the reason we're talking about it is because it has so many contemporary echoes. America is a nation with people who hold competing ideas of conflicting traditions. I just showed that there was an ideal of open immigration at one point, and that ended up getting quashed with those immigration acts of the early 1920s. And I think that what we're seeing play out when we think about today is we're seeing those conflicting traditions continuing. So the 1924 Immigration Act is not ended until 1965. And in 1965, the United States became more open to immigration again, immigration from different places. And we're now at a different moment in American history where there's fear and tremendous concern of immigrants, and the fear that they're inundating the country and that they're taking jobs away from rightful Americans. And you can read various lies about how most of them are supposed to be behaving. I'm not going to repeat them. But those are competing American traditions.
Thinking about those competing traditions, and also thinking again specifically about anti-Semitism and American tradition, talk to us a little bit about what happens in the wake of the Holocaust in American society, the way in which then the Jew is attempting to becoming American, and some of the anti-Semitic expressions or encounters that American Jews may encounter, and think about how we said there's a period of exceptionalism in America. So when does that kind of start to stretch and have an encounter or experience in the American Jewish experience in a way that Jews may not have had the opportunity for that kind of exceptionalism in other societies?
The idea of America as exceptional for Jews, and historians don't really like exceptionalism, I should tell you in general about America. The idea really rests on a major change in the discriminations that Jews and others in American life faced that are gradually abolished after World War II. So, the first thing to mention is that I think some people think that as the newsreels showing what had happened in the German camps were played in movie theaters, that Americans all of a sudden, said we're not going to be anti-Semitic. That's not true by any means, and that instead, what happened is that there's a gradual process of new legislation passed after World War II, Fair Employment Acts, Fair Housing Acts, and ultimately the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And what those new laws do is they end up ending so many racially based discriminations that literally there would be written into restrictive covenants when people bought their houses. It said you cannot sell this house to Jews or Syrians or Armenians, or and they used a word, to people who are of color. There were job ads. You have to kind of be old enough to remember newspapers that had job ads posted, and all of them would say things like Gentiles only, Christians only. Entire companies and corporations would not hire Jews, let alone people of color. And those behaviors, those policies became illegal in the wake of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and some of that other legislation. It allowed Jews who had been excluded from so many spaces, especially from the most elite colleges and universities, which had quotas on their admission, it allowed them to flood into places in American life by the 1970s and 80s where they had been excluded before. But at the same time, anti Semitism did not disappear. It began to take on a new expression as hatred of Israel, anti Zionism.
So I was hoping you would get us there because I'd like you to help our listeners understand this newest manifestation of hatred towards Jews. And we know there's a huge internal debate within the Jewish community around anti Zionism. We also know that anti Zionism within the Jewish community existed prior to the creation of the State of Israel and persists after the creation of the State of Israel. And I think it's fair to say we recognize, and I say we here within American society as well as in the academic arenas, that an anti Zionism that is persistent today, that's denying Jewish peoplehood and denying Jews' agency for self determination, is not the same as the anti Zionist Jewish response that existed pre 1948. Can you unpack that a little bit for our listeners?
So let me start with your last question about anti-Zionist response coming from a particular group of rabbis, was that they did not want to see a Jewish state established because it would endanger their position in their nations. And in fact, if you go back to the Balfour Declaration of 1917, it also recognizes that nothing should be done towards the creation of a Jewish homeland that would endanger the position of Jews in the many different countries in which they lived. But when we get to the roots of the anti-Zionism that you've just described as denying Jewish self-determination, calling Israel an illegitimate state, and essentially calling for the destruction of Israel, where, by the way, 45% of the world's Jews today live, that has very deep roots. They start in the Soviet Union. The Bolsheviks come into power with the Bolshevik Revolution, and they outlawed anti-Semitism because that was discrimination against people, but they were very anti-Zionist. And they deliberately exported that anti-Zionism to the West and to their client states in Africa and the Middle East. And they were so successful that by 1975, the United Nations declared that Zionism is racism. Eventually, the UN will rescind that in 1991, but the damage has been done. The notion that Zionism is a racist movement, and it is, in a sense, if you think about it, calling Zionism racism has an analogy to saying the Jews murdered Jesus, or that, the Jews are nefarious people. It's an old idea morphing into a new mutation. And what I like to think about is not the arguments about when does anti-Zionism cross the line to anti-Semitism. I'm interested in what happens to Jews who live in anti-Zionist societies. And what happens is they ultimately leave. If we look at the Jewish population of the former Soviet Union and we look at particular republics, we'll see that between 1980 and 2018, the percentage of Jews left in some of those republics, 75% of them left, if not more. If we look at what happened across North Africa and the Middle East in the wake of the establishment of the State of Israel, there are different estimates. One is 820,000 Jews fled those countries. Another I've heard recently is actually it was closer to 1.3 million. But the reality is, in 1948, there were 140,000 Jews in Algeria, and by 2017, there were about 50.
The anti-Zionism piece you're talking about, I've learned quite a bit from Isabella Tabarovsky. And I have read a lot of her work. I have had the pleasure of studying and listening to her present many times. And what is fascinating around the influence of the Soviets is the way in which they popularized this anti-Zionist position to make it politically acceptable. So this scientific anti-Zionism, I'm putting in air quotes, which gave this idea some credibility, it's some academic hecture almost, approval, to suggest that this was acceptable in terms of this form of hatred. And for sure, in general, I will say, most Americans don't know enough about the Bolsheviks. They don't know enough about Soviet history, let alone the influence of the Soviets. And they definitely don't know about this production of propaganda of scientific anti-Zionism that occurred that had a very specific ideological agenda. And I'm wondering if you can share with us, Professor Nadell, the way in which that set of ideas of scientific anti-Zionism really has been appropriated for today's discourse that we see playing out, much of which did play out in the academy for a long period of time. But again, in the world of ideas writ large, journalism, those ideas in social justice movements, it played out as well within the way in which politics and political positioning is created.
And it has a longer history than we think. So, for example, the historian Leon Poliakov, who wrote a multi-volumes history of anti-Semitism, at the end of the last one, and he was publishing this in 1968, and he says that first there was the religious theological anti-Judaism. Then we have racial anti-Semitism that leads to the Holocaust. And he's wondering if the next iteration of Jew hate is going to take the form of anti-Zionism. And he said, I'm a historian. I don't know about the future. But I can also tell you that in the wake of the Six-Day War, we see the Black Power movement in the United States embracing these Soviet ideas of anti-Zionism out of solidarity of all peoples of color. And so much so that as early as 1972, one of the leaders of the Anti-Defamation League has actually said the golden age of American Jews, which I'm not sure ever existed, but he said it had when those laws were falling. The golden age is over. There is no more golden age because anti-Zionism and hatred of Israel is morphing into a new expression of Jew hatred.
I hear from so many individuals, and again, Jewish, non-Jewish, it actually doesn't matter, where they will articulate an anti-Zionism and they say that's political discourse. And again, I want to be very clear, Pamela, I'm not talking about serious critique of the current Israeli government, serious issues with settlers engaging in violence against Palestinian communities, which ought to be denounced. That's important. That has to be done. Jews and non-Jews, Israelis, all need to be engaged in that kind of critique. I'm talking again that the starting place is, does Israel have a right to exist? And the answer is no. Do Jews have the right to a sovereignty? And the answer is no. There's this one exception. I'm curious if you can help our listeners understand why this is not political discourse. If you can help them really, in a refined, concise way, understand that what's taking place goes beyond healthy critique and has slipped into this kind of Jew hatred.
The first thing to say is what happened where a man drove a car into a synagogue in West Bloomfield, Michigan. And I mean, I've seen the photos. It's horrific what happened. Had he not been stopped by the security forces that every single Jewish institution has to have, he would have gone plowed right into the preschool of the synagogue. I mean, it's horrible. So I think there are two things. First of all, as you said, there is legitimate critique of any government and its policies. And we see that articulated also in the United States. I would also point out that before October 7th, the massacre of over 1,200 Israelis and taking 251 hostages by the terrorist group Hamas, before that happened, that hundreds of thousands of Israelis were also out in the streets protesting. They were not all enthused with the policies of their governments. That's legitimate. What's illegitimate is to say that the state of Israel has absolutely no right to exist, that Jews, it's illegitimate to deny the fact that Jews have had a long history of living in that land that goes back thousands of years. What is illegitimate is also to blame American Jews who do not vote in Israel, who do not live in Israel, to blame American Jews for the policies of Israel's government, as the perpetrator, apparently, of that attack on that synagogue did, that he said that the Israelis had killed members of his family. Israel says that the members that they killed were actually terrorists, Hezbollah terrorists operating out of Lebanon.
We see in America from the political right and we see from the political left both Jews and Israel weaponized or utilized as political pawns for ideological political platforms. I used to say the hard right and the hard left because I never thought they were so far from the center. Now, Pamela, I don't even say hard right and hard left because unfortunately I see way too much Jew hatred within the base of Democratic and Republican parties, which for me as an American is deeply concerning and as a Jew remains, I think for me, politically homeless in many ways. And I'd like you just to comment on the current politicization of Jews in Israel and what this is doing to American democracy and the fabric of American society.
It is deeply, deeply concerning. Since we're, speaking in higher education, what we have seen is that there was a long-standing Republican plan to go after higher education. Even in October, November of 2023, then candidate Trump said that he had a plan. He released a campaign video where he was going to tax the endowment of the universities, use the funds to create free online university that would then, its graduates would not be woke or jihadists, that was a quote, and that they would then staff the federal government. What happened is that by the time Trump entered his second term of office, that he'd come up with a much better plan, which was not trying to amend the tax laws through Congress, but instead to use anti-Semitism to go after higher education. And as a judge in one of the lawsuits that Harvard had said last summer, she said, what does going after cancer research grants and stripping research grants in medical and scientific knowledge have to do with solving anti-Semitism on the college campus? The reality is there's anti-Semitism on the college campus. There's anti-Semitism all over America. There's anti-Semitism all around the world, and stripping colleges and universities of the grants that make them the preeminent leaders in medical and scientific research in the world is not the solution to ending anti Semitism. And ultimately, if American higher education and scientific and medical research lose their place of preeminence in the world, people are going to remember it happened because of the Jews.
I do think this is a really important issue, and you two recognize there is real anti Semitism in higher ed. And I by no means am here to justify a federal government decision. I agree with you, going after cancer research does not address the issues we're trying to solve for or the rot at the root of the problem. What does need to happen for those who are leaders in higher ed and those who should be accountable to ensuring that institutions of higher ed are the marketplace of ideas, that we have intellectual pluralism and diversity, that academic freedom, and we both value that as academicians, also is understood in relationship with academic integrity. How do we ensure that the leaders of our institutions of higher ed reclaim the purpose of higher ed and address and root out the Jew hatred that does exist?
First of all, I'm not sure they can ever root out Jew hatred. I think that is, a fantasy that I think we all hope could happen, but I don't think it's possible in the world because of the power of these ideas. I think you're making a very important point about the reclaiming what I would say not only the right of academic freedom, but actually the notion that the academy should not be politicized, at least in the classroom. And this has become a serious issue that I think many campuses have been grappling with over the past number of years. So there was a turn in certain departments in the academy to the idea that the reason for the production of knowledge was actually to advance particular points of view to better the world. And the only reason for that knowledge was to become activist and then to inspire students to activism. And I think that particular point of view is problematic. And I think there are many that have tried to kind of recapture the academic integrity of doing scholarship for the sake of scholarship.
I know we have to wrap, Pamela. I could talk to you for so much longer because I find your ideas and insights so valuable. I want to ask you, both in a reflective moment and also as someone who has written an important history here of anti Semitism, knowing that, and I think you and I agree, you can't completely get rid of anti Semitism. You cannot ameliorate it. It is here. There is a reason it is here. These big lies will continue to mutate, will continue to find new ways of expression, even though they are bottled and wrapped in the same stereotypical tropes, whether it's because of Christendom, whether it is because of radical Islamist ideas, whether it is because of some of the ways in which political ideology has taken these ideas. What does it mean for America, an America that does want to aspire to its ideals as a true liberal democracy, to continue to allow Jew hatred to be socially acceptable?
I think the issue is not just that Jew hatred is socially acceptable, but that there are many elements in American society that believe hatred of others is acceptable. And that I don't know how we're going to put the sewer covers back on that. I think that, by the way, is a long American tradition, and it's one that is ascendant at this moment in time, and that anti Semitism, the normalization of anti Semitism, that says a college roommate moves, is assigned to a Jewish roommate and says, I'm not going to live with a Zionist, even though they've never had a conversation about politics. The idea that it's okay to, draw a swastika on the whiteboard, the dorm room, or to run through the halls at night yelling, no Zionists allowed here. These kinds of things that have happened, when they happen to any other group on college campuses, then action has been taken. And colleges have gotten better since the encampments in the spring of 24, have gotten better at enforcing their policies across the board equally. And that is really what needs to be done. on colleges, and I would say also across American society.
Professor Nadell, thank you. Thank you for writing your book.
Thank you.
will encourage folks to read it. Thank you for being an outspoken voice within the academy on these issues. And thank you for just continuing to share your insights, your wisdom, and for teaching us the value of history and how history needs to be informing our understanding of today. So with much appreciation, thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
That's a wrap on today's episode of Boundless Insights. Whether you've been with us from the start or are just discovering our show, we're so glad you're here. If today's conversation sparked a question, challenged your thinking, or made you shake your head, I want to hear from you. Email me at podcast@boundlessisrael.org. Your feedback gives us ideas for new topics and new guests. And if you believe these conversations matter, there are 3 ways to support the show. First, hit that follow button so you never miss an episode. Second, help us spread the word. Share an episode with friends and family, post about it, or mention it in a group chat. It really does make a difference. And third, consider supporting our work. Boundless is a nonprofit, and we rely on donors to keep the show going. You can make a gift at boundlessisrael.org/donate. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep the conversation going.